In the poem At the Water's Edge, Heaney visits the islands on Loch Beg with their early Christian remains. His reaction is a powerful impulse to turn back to the sacred icons of his Catholic youth. Everything in me wanted to bow down, to offer up, to go barefoot, fetal and penitential, and pray at the water's edge. Instead, however, the impulse is overtaken by a memory of the beginnings of political activism. How we crept before we walked. I remembered the helicopters shadowing our march at Newry, the scared, irrevocable steps. This tension underlines the complicated nature of his responses, the confused echoes of Catholic conditioning, and the questions raised by political protest and commitment had long haunted him. What he called the relationship between your imaginative process and your religious background formed the bedrock of the ambitious poem which in 1984 gave its name to his longest collection yet. Station Island is a monumental and audacious autobiographical pilgrimage. A diary entry for the 4th of September 1979 records his first shot at this large undertaking, during a moment of piercing clarity in his Sandymount study by the sea. This morning the sea was bright with sunlight. The tide was into the Strand. Catherine was off to school again for the first time since America. Mary off with her, the boys away to Conwith's. I posted cards and sat in the clear, glittering weather, looking over at Howth Head, the smoke drifting from the pigeon house, the red and white chimneys of the power station, hallucinatory. I felt the lift I used to sense at the seaside in Port Stewart, or on the coast at Dingle or Donegal. I felt that the 7 years since leaving Belfast had paid off, that perhaps steady inward effort would be possible. I felt I could trust. He likened the process of the poem's emergence to the action of a wheel on a watermill, turning round and round, going down empty into the river of memory, coming up full and dispensing its cargo. A year later, he would describe the poem in progress more gloomily as an abandoned building site, with puddles, mud, and unfinished structures all around. But a shape emerged, centred on the creation of the artistic self from all that had gone before. In its exploration of memory and interrogation of the creative process, it presents a kind of artist's odyssey. This long poem underscores and develops Dante's importance for Heaney, as it records a visit to an underworld whose gateway is the religious site Station Island in County Donegal. On the poet's visionary journey, he encounters the ghosts of writers who've gone before him, notably the 19th century Irish novelist William Carleton, who tells him, "We are earthworms of the earth, and all that has gone through us will be our trace." He turned on his heel when he was saying this and headed up the road at the same hard pace. But Station Island isn't just a series of visionary encounters with Irish writers of the past. The first ghosts met by the poet are figures from his youth. Heaney also conjures up the ghosts of murdered men who met terrible ends at the hands of sectarian assassins and who now give their own versions of death and transfiguration. The final encounter is a meeting with the challenging ghost of James Joyce, who gives the poet ruthlessly decisive advice. Suddenly he hit a litter basket with his stick, saying, "Your obligation is not discharged by any common right. What you do, you must do on your own. So get back in harness. The main thing is to write, for the joy of it. Cultivate a work lust that imagines its haven like your hands at night, dreaming the sun in a sunspot of a breast. You are fasted now, light-headed, dangerous. Take off from here, and don't be so earnest. Let others wear the sackcloth and the ashes. Let go, let fly, forget. You've listened long enough. Now strike your note. The poet steps out into the rain, shriven and liberated. Taken as a whole volume, Station Island is a record of autobiography as well as self-examination, and marks a decisive point in Heaney's career. It came at a time when innumerable articles were being published about his work, and books devoted entirely to him had begun to appear. His readings and lectures were sold out, and his reputation in America as well as Britain far outranked that of any contemporary Irish poet. This prominence was reflected in endless interviews and demands on his time. Many drafts of poems in the early 1980s are annotated 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. Not coincidentally, a backlash was on the way. Station Island was reviewed in places that normally give little space to contemporary poetry, as well as in every literary journal one could think of. Generally, it was acclaimed as a powerful intervention, containing some of Heaney's best work so far. But the tone, especially from some fellow poets, could be slightly admonishing. "Keep a clear eye," said one. "Forget about general absolution, and resist more firmly the idea that you must be the best Irish poet since Yeats." If Station Island marked a milestone in Heaney's work, the next book, 3 years later, set up various signposts towards a new direction. Clearances is a series of poems commemorating Heaney's mother, who died in 1984. Here, the homely rituals of domestic farm life are invoked, splitting a block of coal, folding and hanging out sheets on the washing line, peeling potatoes. In these actions, his mother appears as teacher and companion, passionately close to her gifted son. It's the intimate understandings between mother and son, and the regretful evocation of the distancing brought by education and social mobility that strike most sharply home. When all the others were away at Mass, I was all hers as we peeled potatoes. They broke the silence, let fall one by one, like solder weeping off the soldering iron. Cold comforts set between us, things to share, gleaming in a bucket of clean water. And again let fall. Little pleasant splashes from each other's work would bring us to our senses. So while the parish priest at her bedside went hammer and tongs at the prayers for the dying, and some were responding and some crying, I remembered her head bent towards my head, her breath in mine, our fluent dipping knives, never closer the whole rest of our lives. As his mother breathes her last, a pure change happens, projecting a powerful memory into the poet's mind. It concerns a chestnut tree planted from a conker at the time of Heaney's birth in the front hedge of Mossbawn, which had, to his child's all-seeing eye, grown up with him. When Heaney was 15, the family left the house, and the new owners cut the chestnut down. The masterly last sonnet of the sequence unites the clearance of his mother's death with his own sense of mortality, brought on by the loss of his companion tree. I thought of walking round and round a space, utterly empty, utterly a source where the decked chestnut tree had lost its place in our front hedge above the wallflowers. The white chips jumped and skidded high. I heard the hatchet's differentiated, accurate cut, the crack, the sigh, and collapse of what luxuriated through the shocked tips and wreckage of it all. Deep planted and long gone, my coeval chestnut from a jam jar in a hole, its heft and hush become a bright nowhere, a soul, ramifying and forever silent, beyond silence, listened for. The themes of death and translation to another world would press more and more insistently into Heaney's work. He'd already indicated this when he described his reaction to the destruction of his coeval tree in an essay. I began to think of the space where the tree had been. In my mind's eye, I saw it as a kind of luminous emptiness, and in a way that I find hard to define, I began to identify with that space, just as years before I had identified with the young tree. A matter of preparing to be uprooted, to be spirited away into some transparent yet indigenous afterlife. Indigenous afterlives would haunt his work from now on as the pace of his life accelerated. The poems in the 1991 collection, Seeing Things, were bookended by translations from Virgil's Aeneid and Dante's Inferno, both dealing with a trespass into other worlds. Boat journeys and water crossings recur throughout the volume, and rituals of fishing, farming and harvesting are gifted with transcendence. There is a turn away from the political towards the visionary. One poem in particular would become canonical and a favourite in Heaney's own public readings. The annals say, when the monks of Clonmacnoise were all at prayers inside the oratory, a ship appeared above them in the air. The anchor dragged along behind so deep it hooked itself into the altar rails, and then, as the big hull rocked to a standstill, a crewman shinned and grappled down the rope and struggled to release it, but in vain. "This man can't bear our life here and will drown," the abbot said, "unless we help him." So they did. The freed ship sailed, and the man climbed back out of the marvellous as he had known it. Here the idea of visiting another world is raised, and the probability of returning profoundly altered. There are two kinds of marvellous, even perhaps two kinds of truth. Heaney would quote the poem at the end of an Oxford lecture on frontiers of writing. Within the individual self, he concluded, we can reconcile two orders of knowledge which we might call the practical and the poetic. Each redresses the other, and the frontier between them is there for the crossing. In a later interview, Heaney accepted the presence in Seeing Things of a Yeatsian visionary impulse, but added this: "My starlight came in over the half-door of a house with a clay floor, not over the dome of a Byzantine palace." He also stressed the rich resource of the imagery of divine mysteries in his devoutly Catholic youth. "I suppose, like many Catholics, lapsed or not, I am of the Stephen Daedalus frame of mind. If you desert this system, you're deserting the best there is, and there's no point in exchanging one great coherence for some other ad hoc arrangement."